What is up, everybody? This is Marshall Lee of DonkeyJawProjects.com, and today this is the Early Bird Artcast number 46, and I'm going to be talking about tracing today. And I also have a friend here, a returning guest, Mr. Kim Holm. How you doing, man?
Hi, how are you?
Are you there?
Doing
I
good.
see that you're talking, but I don't hear you. I'm not sure why. That's weird. Oh, you know what? I think I have mute set.
How are you?
Ah, there. I see that you're talking, but I don't hear you. Not sure why. That's weird. Now I hear you.
Now I hear you.
All right. Technical difficulties out of the way. So I'm just gonna. I don't have a ton of time this morning, but I am going to talk about tracing here, and then I want to hear your opinion as well, Kim.
Yep.
But recently, I was watching a video by Jason Brubaker. A lot of people know who that is. And he's an amazing comic artist. And I don't, and this in no way, shape, or form is meant to say anything bad about him. I totally respect him. I still respect him. I don't have any issues with him at all. I really love his work. But he said some things in his video that I was like, it kind of was like, huh, really? I don't really know if I quite agree with that. And he was talking about tracing. The video is actually really cool. I already put a link in the description. It's about doing personal projects, and it's kind of ironic that this came up within that video because it's all about personal projects, original, like projects and stuff. So it's just interesting. He was talking about how his experience, kind of how he got to where he's gotten and the professional work he's done, and he was talking about how a lot of professionals do a lot of tracing actually, and you'd be surprised. And I was that kind of caught me off guard, and I was just like, really? And he was talking about it in the context of doing storyboards, but he also talked about this one artist. His name was Tim Bradstreet, um, and he said that he used that as an example. Now I don't know if this is true or whatever, because I think he just kind of assumed this is how the guy did it. I don't know, but he was saying to his friends when he was younger, he's like, this guy, the reason why his art is so amazing is he's like, oh, I know what he's doing. He's tracing the art, and I could do that as well. Or he's tracing, I think, photographs. Excuse me. Um, and there is a point of doing reference, and there's this whole thing of like how Norman Rockwell would like literally map out his pieces kind of with photo reference, but you can kind of tell he changed things and stuff too. And then he talked about when he got into the industry, when he was doing like storyboarding and other things, he said a lot of people trace, like that's normal. And that kind of struck me as weird. It's like, okay, maybe for certain uses I could kind of see that, but like I've always thought, like, when it comes to finished work or professional work, tracing is not good. It's plagiarism in my opinion. Um, but he also brought up this point where it was like he remembers when he finally did start tracing, and I don't think you can tell that Jason Brubaker's work is original. I mean, go watch the video, you'll see what I'm talking about. Like I don't think Jason is quite tracing is tracing in a bad way, but you know, and I don't think he even does that heavily even now. It was something he used, I think, more for like storyboarding, which that is almost maybe more permissible because it's not a final product to me. But he was talking about how when he started tracing, for practice, he actually learned way quicker than if he was just drawing from reference. And, you know, so that's interesting. So to me, there's another video and this is the way I tend to think. Another video by one of my favorite artists, Kesh, on YouTube, and he did this video. He did a couple videos kind of on this topic, but one of the videos was, it's almost like he was correcting what people had thought. So he was saying it's actually the most recent video, but I put it in the show notes. Also, the Jason Brubaker one I put in the show notes. But he he was talking about how tracing or from somebody's artwork and then passing it off as your own. That's wrong. That's plagiarism. That's I think most artists agree with that. But for learning purposes, it's actually can be really helpful, even to learn somebody else's kind of style, learn kind of some of the shortcuts they take, but don't ever like take that style and pass it off as your own, basically. So that's another interesting video on the topic. So I don't know. There's so much to unpack here. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of controversy with like Holly Brown and other people, and like Greg Land, and how heavily he uses reference and stuff like that. And I don't know. It's just interesting. There's also the idea of like rotoscoping that has been done in animation. And I'll be honest, I've never liked that effect anyways. But I mean, it's been used, and that's like literally tracing photo reference to make animation. So like what about that? Is that okay? I personally don't like that use of creating animation, but I don't know. It's obviously been accepted and used by even like Disney and stuff like that. So I don't know. What do you think, Kim, about all this stuff?
Well, I think that Tim Bradstreet is a very good example, because Bradstreet he did all the best art for the White Wolf role-playing games, the Vampire the Masquerade and that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And his stuff is heavily photo-based.
Mm-hmm.
And you can even, it is traced, but if you try to trace his exact stuff, you will not get the same result. He manages to put his own style on the art, and it looks identifiably as Tim Bradstreet every time, no matter how photo-based it is. So if you're doing that, then what's wrong? The thing that is most problematic with tracing is that people don't really realize that it's an art form in itself. It's just like penciling or inking or painting. It's not something that you can just do because you know how to pencil or you know how to paint. If you want to trace a photo in a good way, then you have to learn the art of tracing so that it melds into your style completely fluidly. And most people, the problem when they trace is that it looks totally different from anything else they do. My comic book, Pigman's Model, about 50% of that is traced on top of photographies. And I think you can tell what parts, for the most part, but also in between the traced images, there's one or two images where I simply didn't have the correct reference and found it quicker to draw it instead of instead of tracing it, photographing it and tracing it. And I'm pretty certain that you can't find which images are traced and which images are just in the same style as the traced ones.
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, I dare anyone to find anything wrong with it.
Mm-hmm.
But the same is also true for a lot of swiping and that kind of stuff. Eric Larson on Twitter posted some great images of artists swiping their own art, like superhero comic book artists who are drawing the same picture again and again throughout 20 years of their career, just using the same shot. And if a reader notices it, then that's bad. But if someone just reads it for the story and it helps tell the story, then I don't think it's wrong. It doesn't make for great art, but it can make for great stories. And in the case of a comic book, the story is primary, so you do anything you can to tell the story,
Yeah.
including swiping yourself.
Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting point too, and that's something I've actually brought up as well on this channel before. Is, you know, when it comes to comics and even, you know, animation a lot and stuff like that, you know, the story is the art. I mean, the art is the art too, but most importantly, the storytelling is the art. So, you know, you know, there's certain things that I feel like are kind of permissible, even to the point of using poses of other artists. I think is perfectly fine. Which is funny, you brought up Eric Larson, and it depends. Again, I think it depends on how heavily you you do this, you know. But Eric Larson was somebody who I actually had a little bit of correspondence with, just a tiny bit, over Twitter. And you know, he was talking about how what's his name? I can't think. Oh, Bob Kane
Yeah.
was known for kind of swiping other artists. And you know, I did a little research on that actually, and you know, I mean, back then, and maybe still now, I don't know, but back then, that was like that's how they did it. Like, so many artists swiped other artists' poses and stuff. And to me, swiping a pose, I don't know, like, I guess it depends on how far you go with it, but if you're just taking the underlying structure of the pose, I think that's kind of actually okay. But you know, I don't know. I mean, I'm not here to like, I'm not even interested in being like the judge of what's okay and what's not or anything. But I do think it's interesting, and it's something that we as artists need to not just kind of go willy nilly. We need to think about what we feel is right. Like, there's a moral issue, but there's also, you know, aesthetic issues and things like that. You know, there's just so much to this. But you know, one thing that I don't like is when people start running around and accusing other people and looking for it. And it's really like, you know, the whole thing with like Holly Brown to me is silly. Like, she wasn't even using that really for a finished piece, I don't think. And you know, she got pretty well heckled online, and I don't think it was deserved, first of all. And you know, second of all, who is anybody to really judge and stuff like that? But that being said, there is a certain level of tracing that I'm not, you know, comfortable with. Even using photo reference, there's a certain level for my own personal self. I wouldn't judge somebody else, but um, you know, like, I don't. If you're like using reference to the point where you're, you know, you're kind of using it to help make your art look realistic and um kind of do things that you couldn't do without the reference. Like, I don't know if that's a good thing. Like, if you can't do that without the reference, then
yeah, I think generally you have to be able to pull the same thing off, or nearly pull it off, without the tracing. Otherwise, it will look it will look off, and that's what you don't want. But I think there's you mentioned another type of tracing as well. If you're tracing for practice, that can be a really good way of analyzing someone else's style. So for instance, if I have a job where I'm going to do someone else's style for one image for whatever purpose, then I would do a couple of exercises. One would be to find the basic shapes, the circles and the squares, and the what the building material of his or her characters. The other would be to trace, and then combining those two things, I would actually pretty quickly be able to do an approximation of almost anyone's style, at least in terms of comic book styles. So that's a really important tool for analyzing other people's art. But you also have this tracing in order to get the finished result that you can't do in a timely manner otherwise. For instance, what you find in a lot of comic books is that the backgrounds will be traced, and you find people who are masterful at doing this, like David Mazzucchelli did it a lot in his Daredevil stuff, and it looks spectacular every time. And you also find people who just very quickly put some ink on top of a photography. And one of the kids in one of my comic classes a few years back actually came up to me with an image and asked, "Why does this background look so weird?" And I could tell him instantly, because it's traced. And the problem there isn't, again, it isn't the tracing, it is that a kid asked why it's so weird. Why don't it look like the rest of the book? And in order to make it look reasonably similar to the rest of the book, you really have to know both how to draw it yourself and how to interpret a photograph in the right way, in the way that makes it meld with your style. And with the swiping of other people's poses, I'm very glad that we don't live in the 40s. I'm very glad. When I see stuff like Bob Kane's swiping, it's too much. But again, the main problem with Bob Kane's art wasn't that he swiped; it was that he wasn't really that good, and he took credit from artists who were better. Not just the ones he swiped, but also the ones he paid.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that's probably one of the. I mean, I don't think that Bob Kane. I think Bob Kane left an important mark on comics. He was important to a certain degree, but at the same time, those who accuse him of kind of taking credit for things and stuff like that, and kind of doing some what would be maybe some immoral things creatively, I think they're kind of right. I mean, obviously, I think there's no reason why he shouldn't have given more credit to Bill Finger, especially later on as things, came out and stuff. Um, but at the same time, his contribution isn't nothing. There is something to his contribution as well, kind of similar as Stan Lee. But anyways,
Yeah,
there's a lot more to that than tracing and art. So. And it's interesting that you brought up Tim Bradstreet, because that's actually the exact artist that Jason Brubaker was talking about in his video as well, which I don't really know anything about that artist, but I don't know. There's even certain amounts of using reference to me feels uncomfortable personally, but at the same time, I have been more freed up to do some kind of tracing and reference stuff for the sake of storytelling, but I try to keep it as loose as I can. And tracing doesn't go into finished artwork. That's more just for learning. And I was encouraged by Jason Brubaker's video and Kesh's to actually start tracing some other artists to just for learning. I think that's helpful.
Yeah, I figured out that Tim Bradstreet's, I was really fond of him when I was 14, 15, 16 years old. And I figured out how he got his amazing style. And that's when I started experimenting with tracing. And that's when I figured out that even though Bradstreet traces, I can't do his style just by tracing. It's not that simple.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to check in with the chat real quick. If you guys want to see, I just did a little tracing myself. It's actually hard to do. Like I want to try it on the computer because you can't really see through this paper very well, but anyways, I don't know if I learned much because I think your mind has to be more involved than it is right now for me. I'm obviously doing a hangout, so but let's check out, see if there's any. Oh, actually, I don't know if there is anything in the chat today, which is surprising. Usually there is, but that's okay. Totally okay if nobody's. I'm just refreshing real quick to make sure, because sometimes it doesn't pop up. But yeah, I'm glad you came on, Kim, because
but let's check out.
Whoops.
See if there's any, oh, actually, I don't know if there is anything.
I did it again. I'm glad you came on, Kim, because you definitely helped me see some kind of history of it, and you brought up really some good points. The idea that even tracing is an art form unto itself. That's something I hadn't quite thought of. I think that's really interesting.
If I can just jump in with a final little thing.
Yeah.
Have you heard of David Hockney's book on the use of camera obscura in Renaissance and classical painting?
No.
That's a pretty great book, which shows how from the Renaissance and on, the masters of painting used the camera obscura, which is a sort of a lens device, in order to quickly trace down their models, so that they could, accurately paint afterwards. So that's why a lot of the artists in a certain age painted by themselves, and they were always in this room by themselves because they didn't want to reveal their trade secrets. But if you try, the evidence that David Hockney has for this is pretty. Some of them are 100%. You can't, if you can draw and you can understand his arguments, it's undeniable that this was traced. But if you use a camera obscura or similar device, and trace your models, you will not start painting like a Renaissance master. It's simply, it's got nothing to do with it. They used it as a very valuable tool, as a scientific tool for improving one aspect of their process. And then 90% of the rest is just their magic. And,
right.
yeah.
And since you brought that up, I mean, one thing that, you know, has to kind of be said here in this kind of discussion is, if you go to any art school and you get, you know, to any level of that school, eventually they're going to start telling you to do master studies, specifically on the Renaissance artists, but many other ways too, you know. So master studies, you're literally, your whole goal is to make it look exactly like what you're looking at. You shouldn't have any of your own style. You shouldn't be able to tell if you've done a master study well. You shouldn't be able to tell one painting from the other. I mean, does anybody quite get to that level? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know, but that's the goal at least, and it's a learning tool, you know. So it is. I think again, it is very helpful and important for learning, and even maybe a little bit for some helpful in laying out images, as long as you're not, you know, doing it in such a way where you're literally tracing or literally copying exactly. You know, there's kind of a fine line, I think. And I don't know, again, I'm not trying to lay down the law for what it is. I'm just trying to say these are the things I'm thinking about with my own art, and how far do I want to go? How far do I feel is okay and not okay, you know? So.
And again, to people who dislike tracing, what's the difference between an artist tracing a photograph and another artist using a grid and a measuring tool to trace the real world? It's the grid is a less effective type of tracing, but again, you know, you can use the grid as much as you want. It will not make your landscape painting good unless you are actually good.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't talk about the grid, but that's another one I'm personally not all that comfortable with. But, you know, again, I don't judge anybody, and it is a method used by artists. So, but again, you know, Kim brings up a great point. You know, you can do that all you want, but will it actually result in a good piece of art? You'd have to be really skillful to be able to make it turn into a good piece of art, you know. So, you know, there's a lot of fine lines and gray lines here, you know. So anyways, that I think is gonna about do it. But again, I thank you, Kim, for coming on. Everybody should check out Kim's artwork. I mean, what you're painting right now looks pretty awesome.
Thank you.
And it reminds me of Dante's Inferno or something like.
Something like
that. But yeah, so definitely check out Kim's stuff. His link is in the description below. And yeah, I think that's going to be about it. Thanks again, Kim, for coming on. And we will talk to everybody later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.